Stop! Do not carry out the king's command. The desperate cry shattered the heavy silence hanging over Blackstone Square, but only after every soul present had already heard the order that no one believed could ever be spoken. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood upon the ancient stone platform with the weight of an entire kingdom resting across his shoulders, his black ceremonial armor reflecting the pale morning light beneath a sky covered with slow-moving gray clouds. His expression remained cold enough to convince the crowd that justice had overcome mercy, yet deep within his steady gaze lived a storm that no one could see. Before him stood Grace Bennet, the Omega once admired throughout the royal palace for her kindness, now surrounded by silent royal guards after being condemned for betraying the crown. Her hands remained peacefully folded before her, her cream-colored gown stirred gently by the wind, and her blue eyes never left the man she had once trusted without hesitation. Around them, hundreds of citizens filled the square, whispering in disbelief. Some lowered their heads in sorrow. Others searched Grace's face, hoping to discover fear, anger, or desperation. Instead, they found only quiet dignity. She had not begged for mercy. She had not cursed the Alpha King. She had not denied the accusations one final time. She simply accepted each passing second with the calm of someone who believed that truth would someday outlive every lie. Ethan slowly raised one hand, signaling that the royal sentence would now be fulfilled. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Even the banners flying above the castle walls appeared frozen by the unbearable tension. Lord Adrian Holloway watched from the council platform, his elegant crimson robes untouched by the wind, his composed expression carefully hiding the satisfaction growing within him. Years of careful planning had finally brought him to this moment. The woman who had quietly earned the affection of the kingdom would disappear, and no one would ever uncover the deception buried beneath layers of convincing evidence. Ethan forced himself not to look away from Grace. He wanted to see hatred in her eyes. Because hatred would have made this decision easier to carry. Instead, he saw sadness, not for herself, but for him. That single look unsettled him more deeply than every accusation that had been placed before the royal council. Somewhere inside his heart, a quiet voice continued asking the same impossible question. What if she had been telling the truth all along? He silenced the thought before it could weaken his resolve. A king ruled through evidence, not emotion. That was the lesson his father had taught him since childhood. His voice echoed across the square with unwavering authority. Carry out the judgment. The command had barely left his lips when hurried footsteps echoed across the stone streets leading toward the platform. Palace guards instinctively stepped aside as royal healer Charlotte Reed rushed forward, breathless from running through the castle without stopping. Her usually calm face had turned pale, and tears glistened in her eyes as she raised both hands toward the platform. "Your Majesty," she cried, struggling to steady her breathing, "you cannot do this." Every conversation stopped instantly. Ethan frowned, surprised by the urgency in Charlotte's voice. She had never interrupted a royal judgment before. The healer climbed the final steps without waiting for permission, then looked directly into the Alpha King's eyes with absolute certainty. "Grace Bennet is innocent of the one truth that matters today," she said softly before taking one trembling breath. "She is carrying your only heir." Time itself seemed to stop. The wind faded into silence. The whispers disappeared. Ethan stared at Charlotte, unable to move, before slowly turning toward Grace once again. She lowered her eyes, not because she feared him, but because she had never intended to save herself by revealing the child growing quietly beneath her heart. 10 days earlier, the palace had been filled with a peace that now felt almost impossible to remember. Morning sunlight spilled across the eastern gardens, where Grace Bennet quietly cared for rows of healing herbs that had become as familiar to her as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Palace servants greeted her with genuine smiles. Children of the royal staff often paused beside the flower beds to hear her stories, and even the oldest guards softened their expressions whenever she passed. Grace never sought admiration, yet kindness had a way of leaving its own quiet mark upon every person she met. From the highest balcony overlooking the gardens, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood watched the peaceful scene without announcing his presence. He admired the way Grace treated every servant with the same respect she offered the members of the royal council. She remembered names, listened patiently, and offered encouragement without expecting praise in return. More than once Ethan had wondered how someone could possess such gentle strength in a kingdom where power usually spoke louder than compassion. He rarely allowed himself to linger on those thoughts. A king had responsibilities that demanded discipline above personal desire. Still, whenever Grace smiled, the burden resting upon his shoulders seemed just a little lighter. Not everyone welcomed the growing affection surrounding the young Omega. Lord Adrian Holloway observed the same quiet moments from the shadows of the council hall, his sharp eyes measuring every smile Grace received and every glance the king unknowingly directed toward her. Years spent climbing through the ranks of the royal court had taught him that influence was more dangerous than any weapon. Grace had never asked for influence, yet she possessed it simply because people trusted her. To Adrian, that trust represented an obstacle that could not remain. Rather than striking openly, he began weaving a careful web of doubt. A missing report was quietly placed among Grace's responsibilities. A confidential message arrived at the wrong destination after passing through hands loyal to Adrian. Minor misunderstandings appeared across the palace, each one small enough to dismiss alone but unsettling when viewed together. Whenever questions arose, Adrian never pointed directly at Grace. Instead, he simply suggested that every possibility deserved consideration. His calm voice and measured concern made suspicion appear reasonable instead of cruel. Ethan noticed the unusual incidents, but refused to draw quick conclusions. He personally questioned several officials, reviewed records, and even spoke privately with Grace. She answered every question honestly, her steady blue eyes never wavering as she explained each misunderstanding. Her sincerity reassured him, yet every answer seemed to be followed by another unexplained problem somewhere else inside the palace. The pattern slowly became impossible to ignore. Grace sensed the atmosphere changing long before anyone openly accused her. Conversations became quieter whenever she entered a room. Servants who had once laughed freely beside her now looked uncertain, afraid that simple friendship might place them under suspicion as well. She carried the growing loneliness with quiet dignity, believing that truth would eventually restore what rumors had begun to steal. She did not realize that someone had carefully designed every step of her downfall long before the first whisper ever reached the royal court. Standing alone beneath the blooming trees that evening, Ethan watched the wind scatter white flower petals across the garden paths. For reasons he could not explain, an uneasy feeling settled deep within his heart. He still believed in Grace, but for the first time he also feared that the evidence gathering around her might someday force him to choose between the woman he trusted and the duty he had sworn to uphold. The following morning, the royal council gathered beneath the towering stone arches of the great chamber, where generations of Alpha Kings had delivered judgments that shaped the kingdom's history. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting long bands of crimson and gold across the polished marble floor, yet the beauty of the room did little to soften the tension hanging in the air. Grace Bennet stood quietly before the council, her cream-colored gown simple and dignified, her hands resting calmly before her as every pair of eyes turned toward the woman who had suddenly become the center of growing suspicion. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood sat upon the royal seat with the same composed expression he had shown before countless official hearings, but today his heart carried a burden unlike any he had known before. He wanted answers, not confirmation of guilt. Lord Adrian Holloway stepped forward with measured confidence, placing sealed documents upon the long oak table before the council elders. His movements remained calm, his voice respectful, never accusing Grace directly. Instead, he presented each piece of evidence as though he reluctantly wished to protect the kingdom from an unfortunate possibility. A missing supply ledger had supposedly been handled by Grace shortly before it disappeared. A confidential message had reached the wrong destination after passing through an office she occasionally visited. A palace servant claimed to have seen her speaking privately with an unknown traveler near the eastern gate during the previous week. Each detail appeared small on its own, yet together they formed a picture that slowly became difficult to dismiss. Ethan examined every document personally before allowing the council to review it. Nothing appeared obviously false. The signatures matched official records. The royal seals seemed authentic. Witnesses answered questions with quiet confidence. He searched constantly for contradictions, hoping to discover something that would immediately clear Grace's name, yet every answer seemed to strengthen the same troubling conclusion. Finally, Ethan looked directly at Grace. The entire chamber fell silent. "Grace Bennet," he said, his voice steady despite the conflict within him, "is there anything you wish to tell this council before we continue?" Grace lifted her blue eyes to meet his. There was disappointment within them, but not anger. "Only the truth, Your Majesty," she answered softly. "I have never betrayed you. I have never betrayed this kingdom. I cannot explain every accusation because many things being said today never happened. But I will not invent stories simply because the truth sounds too simple to defend itself." Her calm response echoed through the chamber. Several council members exchanged uncertain glances. Even a few guards shifted uncomfortably where they stood. Ethan wanted desperately to believe her words, yet every official record before him seemed to point in another direction. Duty demanded that he weigh evidence above personal trust, no matter how painful that responsibility became. Lord Adrian lowered his eyes with carefully rehearsed regret. "No one wishes this outcome," he said quietly. "But loyalty to the crown requires difficult decisions." Ethan remained silent for several long moments before ordering that the investigation continue while Grace remained under royal supervision until a final judgment could be reached. Grace bowed respectfully without protest. She did not plead for freedom. She did not ask Ethan to trust her without proof. As the guards gently escorted her from the chamber, she looked back only once. Ethan saw no hatred in her expression, only quiet sorrow that the man she believed understood her better than anyone now seemed farther away than ever before. Watching her disappear beyond the great wooden doors, Ethan felt a weight settle heavily upon his heart, unable to escape the growing fear that whatever decision awaited him would change both of their lives forever. Grace Bennet was escorted to a quiet chamber inside the eastern wing of the palace rather than a cold dungeon, a decision made personally by Alpha King Ethan Blackwood despite the objections of several council members. The room overlooked the same garden she had cared for only days before, but the windows now felt like silent reminders of a life slipping farther beyond her reach. Two respectful royal guards remained outside the door, instructed not to treat her as a criminal but not to allow her freedom either. Grace accepted the arrangement without complaint. She spent most of the afternoon sitting beside the window, watching white flower petals drift across the garden paths while wondering how quickly trust could disappear when fear found enough convincing evidence. As evening settled over the castle, royal healer Charlotte Reed quietly entered the room carrying a small basket filled with tea, fresh bread, and several medicinal herbs. She smiled gently before placing everything upon the wooden table. "You have barely eaten today," she said softly. Grace thanked her with the same kindness she had always shown, though exhaustion had become impossible to hide behind her calm expression. Charlotte noticed the unusual paleness in Grace's face and the faint dizziness that appeared whenever she stood too quickly. "Please allow me to examine you," she requested. Grace agreed without hesitation. Charlotte carefully completed a full healer's examination with the patience and professionalism that had earned her the trust of the royal family for many years. As the examination continued, her expression slowly changed from quiet concentration to complete surprise. She paused for a long moment before looking directly into Grace's eyes. "You are expecting a child," she whispered with absolute certainty. The room fell silent. Grace instinctively placed one trembling hand across her stomach, unable to speak. She had sensed subtle changes within herself during the past several days, but the endless accusations and investigation had pushed every personal thought into the background. Tears slowly filled her eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that a new life had already begun while the world around her was falling apart. Charlotte gently rested a reassuring hand upon Grace's shoulder. "The child appears healthy," she said. "You must tell the king immediately." Grace slowly shook her head. No. Charlotte looked at her in disbelief. He deserves to know. Grace lowered her eyes, her voice quiet but unwavering. If Ethan no longer believes my words, he will never believe that I remained silent until now for any reason except to save myself. I will not allow our child to become a final argument in a trial that should be decided by truth alone. Charlotte wanted to protest, yet she understood the heartbreaking honesty behind Grace's decision. She promised to keep the secret for the moment, hoping there would still be time to change Grace's mind before the final judgment. As Charlotte prepared to leave, the chamber door briefly opened. Lord Adrian Holloway stood in the hallway speaking politely with one of the guards before his gaze drifted toward the room. His eyes met Charlotte's for only an instant, but he immediately noticed the unusual concern upon her face. Although he heard nothing, years of careful observation had taught him to recognize when something unexpected had occurred. His expression remained perfectly composed as he continued walking down the corridor, yet a quiet sense of suspicion settled into his thoughts. Inside the chamber, Grace returned to the window and watched darkness slowly cover the royal gardens. She gently rested both hands over the tiny life only she and Charlotte knew existed, silently praying that whatever happened next, the child would one day inherit a kingdom where truth mattered more than carefully constructed lies. The final day arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel, and the entire kingdom seemed to awaken with an uneasy silence that settled over every street leading toward Blackstone Square. Citizens gathered hours before sunrise, filling balconies, stone stairways, and every open space surrounding the royal platform. No one spoke above a whisper. The rumors that had spread throughout the kingdom during the previous week had divided friends, families, and neighbors, yet almost everyone shared the same disbelief that the gentle Omega who had once brought comfort to the palace gardens was now walking toward the greatest judgment of her life. Grace Bennet stepped from the eastern wing escorted by royal guards whose respectful silence revealed far more compassion than their official duty allowed them to express. She wore the same cream-colored gown she had chosen herself that morning, refusing every offer to change into darker ceremonial clothing. She wanted to face whatever awaited her as the woman she had always been, not as the person the accusations claimed she had become. Hidden beneath the flowing fabric rested the precious secret that only she and royal healer Charlotte Reed knew. As she placed one steady foot after another upon the ancient stone streets, Grace quietly promised the tiny life growing within her that fear would never be the final lesson this child inherited from its mother. Inside the royal chambers overlooking the square, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood stood alone before the tall windows, watching thousands of his people gather below. Sleep had not visited him the night before. Every witness statement, every sealed document, every report from the investigation had been reviewed again until dawn, yet nothing had changed the conclusion demanded by the evidence placed before him. Still, the memory of Grace's unwavering eyes inside the council chamber refused to leave his thoughts. He had judged countless disputes since becoming king, but never had certainty felt so painfully distant. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Charlotte entered carrying several medical records, her expression unusually tense. She opened her mouth as though preparing to speak, but Grace's heartfelt request echoed inside her mind. She had promised to protect the secret. Breaking that promise without Grace's consent felt like betraying the very trust she had sworn to preserve as a healer. Ethan noticed her hesitation. "Is something wrong?" he asked quietly. Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Only that I wish today were different, Your Majesty." Before Ethan could question her further, another council member arrived to announce that the kingdom was waiting. Charlotte watched him leave with growing panic tightening around her heart. Every instinct told her that silence was no longer protecting anyone. Meanwhile, Lord Adrian Holloway stood near the royal platform greeting council members with calm dignity, carefully concealing the satisfaction hidden beneath his composed smile. Everything had unfolded exactly as planned. The investigation had reached its inevitable conclusion, public confidence rested firmly behind the crown, and by sunset the greatest obstacle to his influence would quietly disappear from the kingdom's future. As the great bells echoed across Blackstone Square, Grace ascended the stone steps with remarkable composure. Ethan took his place before the assembled kingdom, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath his calm authority. Their eyes met across the platform for one long moment. Neither spoke. Neither looked away. The silence between them carried more truth than every accusation presented during the investigation. Then, as the royal official prepared to begin the formal judgment, Charlotte suddenly looked from Grace to the king and realized that if she remained silent for even one more minute, the secret she had promised to protect would instead become the truth she could never forgive herself for hiding. Charlotte Reed could no longer hear the pounding of the great bells or the restless murmurs flowing through Blackstone Square. All she could hear was the promise she had made to Grace and the oath she had taken as the royal healer. One demanded silence. The other demanded truth. As the royal official prepared to continue the ceremony, Charlotte stepped forward without waiting for permission. Her sudden movement drew every eye in the square. Royal guards instinctively moved aside, recognizing the urgency written across her face. Ethan Blackwood frowned, surprised by the interruption. "Charlotte," he said firmly, "this is not the time." She looked directly into his eyes, her voice trembling but unwavering. "Your Majesty, this is the only time." The entire square fell into complete silence. Even the wind seemed to pause between the towering castle walls. Charlotte took one slow breath before speaking the words that would forever change the kingdom. "Grace Bennet is expecting a child." A wave of astonishment spread through the crowd, but Charlotte was not finished. She continued before anyone could interrupt. "I confirmed it myself. There is no doubt. The child she carries is your heir." Ethan stared at her without moving. His expression remained frozen, as though his mind could not accept what his ears had just heard. Slowly, almost against his own will, his eyes turned toward Grace. She stood exactly where she had been moments before, her hands resting gently before her, tears quietly gathering in her blue eyes. She had never spoken a single word about the child. She had never asked for sympathy. She had never attempted to change his judgment by revealing the truth. That realization struck Ethan with far greater force than Charlotte's announcement itself. If Grace had truly wished to save herself at any cost, she would have revealed the pregnancy during the council hearing days earlier. Instead, she had chosen silence because she wanted justice to stand on truth rather than personal mercy. Ethan slowly descended from the royal platform until only a few feet separated them. His voice, usually so steady before his people, carried an unfamiliar softness. "Is it true?" Grace looked into his eyes with heartbreaking honesty. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I learned only a few days ago." Ethan struggled to find the next words. "Why did you not tell me?" Grace lowered her gaze for a brief moment before answering. "Because I wanted you to believe me as Grace, not because of the child I carry. If your trust depended upon our baby, then it was never truly trust." Her answer echoed across the silent square. Several council members lowered their heads in quiet shame. Even citizens who had accepted the accusations now exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan felt every memory of the previous days rush through his mind with painful clarity. Every piece of evidence had pointed toward guilt, yet the woman standing before him had never once used the greatest truth of all to protect herself. Suddenly, the carefully assembled investigation no longer appeared as solid as it once had. Tiny inconsistencies he had dismissed now returned with unsettling force. Witnesses who had sounded convincing suddenly seemed rehearsed. Documents that had appeared flawless now felt almost too perfect. Ethan turned sharply toward the council platform where Lord Adrian Holloway stood watching with remarkable composure. For the first time since the investigation had begun, Ethan saw not confidence in Adrian's face but calculation. The Alpha King's heart sank as one terrifying possibility became impossible to ignore. If Grace had hidden the one truth that could have saved her, then perhaps someone else had been hiding every lie that condemned her. The ceremony ended without another word of judgment, but the questions it left behind echoed through the kingdom for days. Ethan Blackwood immediately suspended the case against Grace Bennet and ordered every document, witness statement, an official record connected to the investigation to be examined again by an entirely new panel of royal investigators. This time, no member of the original council was allowed to supervise the review, including Lord Adrian Holloway. Ethan wanted fresh eyes unclouded by assumptions. Grace was moved to a private residence within the palace where Charlotte Reed could monitor her health in peace. Although she was no longer treated as a prisoner, she remained emotionally distant, spending most of her days looking across the quiet gardens without asking whether the investigation would clear her name. She had already learned how fragile trust could become. Ethan visited only once during those first several days, but when he reached her door, he quietly turned away before knocking. He knew that an apology offered before the truth was fully uncovered would sound more like an attempt to ease his own conscience than to honor her pain. Meanwhile, the new investigation began revealing details that had somehow escaped everyone's attention before. A palace clerk discovered that one confidential ledger carried an official seal that had been impressed with an outdated royal stamp retired nearly 2 years earlier. Another investigator found that 2 witness statements, supposedly written days apart by different people, contained identical phrasing and even the same uncommon spelling mistake. Financial records uncovered a series of generous payments made to individuals who had testified against Grace shortly before the council hearing. None of those discoveries alone proved a conspiracy, but together they painted a picture that became increasingly impossible to ignore. Ethan personally questioned every witness again, this time without the presence of the council. Several remained confident, yet their stories no longer matched each other as closely as they had during the original hearing. Small inconsistencies grew larger with every conversation. Timelines shifted. Details changed. Certainty slowly unraveled into hesitation. At last, one frightened palace messenger admitted that he had been instructed to deliver documents through Lord Adrian Holloway's private office rather than the normal royal archives. That single confession opened the door to everything else. Hidden correspondence was uncovered inside a locked cabinet belonging to Adrian's senior aide. The letters described careful plans to isolate Grace, manipulate official records, and quietly shape public opinion until suspicion became stronger than truth. Ethan read every page himself, each sentence feeling heavier than the one before it. By the time the final document was placed upon his desk, there was no room left for doubt. Lord Adrian Holloway had spent months constructing an illusion so convincing that even the king had accepted it as reality. Ethan closed the final letter and remained seated in silence long after the investigators had left the chamber. The greatest mistake of his reign had not been trusting the wrong evidence. It had been failing to recognize that the woman he loved had never once asked him to choose emotion over justice. She had only hoped he would keep searching until justice finally found the truth. As evening settled over the palace, Ethan looked toward the softly glowing windows of the residence where Grace rested. For the first time since the investigation had begun, he knew with complete certainty that proving her innocence would only be the beginning. Earning back the trust he had broken would become the hardest judgment he would ever face. The official announcement restoring Grace Bennett's honor spread throughout the kingdom before sunset, and everywhere it was read, people lowered their heads with quiet regret. The accusations were withdrawn, the false testimony was erased from the royal record, and every decree connected to the investigation was formally revoked by order of Alpha King Ethan Blackwood himself. Yet none of those words could erase the memory of the day Grace had stood alone before the entire kingdom while those she trusted questioned her character. Several days passed before Ethan found the courage to approach the peaceful residence where Charlotte Reed continued caring for Grace. He arrived without royal guards, ceremonial armor, or the symbols of his authority. Dressed only in a simple dark coat, he looked less like the ruler of a powerful kingdom and more like a man carrying the weight of a mistake he could never completely undo. Charlotte greeted him with a quiet nod before leaving them alone inside the sunlit sitting room overlooking the gardens. Grace stood near the open window, watching gentle spring rain fall across the flower beds she had once tended every morning. She turned as Ethan entered, offering him a polite smile that held neither bitterness nor warmth. It was the careful kindness people reserved for strangers. That distance hurt Ethan more deeply than any harsh words could have. For several moments neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan stepped forward and lowered his head. "Grace," he said quietly, "I came here because there are no words strong enough to repair what I allowed to happen. I failed you as your king. I failed you as the man who should have trusted your heart when everything else became uncertain." Grace listened without interrupting. Ethan continued, his voice growing softer. "Every decision I made followed the evidence before me, but I have learned that evidence can be manipulated when honest people stop asking difficult questions. I cannot change what you endured. I cannot ask you to forget it. I only wanted you to hear that I accept full responsibility for my failure." Grace remained silent for a long moment before answering. "I never wanted perfection from you, Ethan. I understood that being king meant making impossible choices. What broke my heart was not that you investigated me. It was that somewhere along the way, the trust we had built together became weaker than papers placed upon a table." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, knowing she spoke the painful truth. "You are right," he admitted. "I believed I was protecting the kingdom, but I forgot that justice requires patience as much as certainty." Grace gently rested one hand over the child growing within her. "Our baby deserves parents who choose truth before fear," she said softly. "If we cannot become those people, then no apology will ever be enough." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I will not ask for forgiveness today." He looked directly into her eyes with quiet determination. "I will earn it one day through every decision I make from this moment forward." Grace saw no royal pride remaining in his expression. Only humility, regret, and a sincere desire to become worthy of the trust he had lost. She did not step closer, but neither did she turn away. As Ethan quietly prepared to leave, Grace spoke once more. "Healing does not happen because someone says they are sorry. It happens because every day afterward proves those words were true." Ethan paused at the doorway before offering a grateful nod. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, both of them understood that the hardest part of their journey was no longer uncovering the truth. It was learning whether two wounded hearts could slowly find their way back to one another. Nearly 9 months later, the first light of spring spread across the kingdom with a warmth that seemed to reach every corner of Blackstone Castle. The long season of uncertainty had finally given way to quiet hope. The palace gardens bloomed more beautifully than they had in years, restored under Grace Bennet's gentle care, while laughter once again drifted through the stone courtyards where silence had once lingered. Much had changed since the day truth overturned judgment. Alpha King Ethan Blackwood had quietly reformed the royal justice system, requiring every serious accusation to be reviewed by multiple independent investigators before any final decision could ever be made again. He never announced those changes as acts of redemption. He simply believed that no innocent person should ever endure what Grace had endured. Day after day, he allowed his actions to speak where apologies had already reached their limit. Grace watched those changes with cautious optimism. Trust did not return all at once, but every promise Ethan kept became another small stone laid across the broken bridge between their hearts. He attended every medical appointment Charlotte Reed recommended, listened carefully to every piece of advice, and never once treated Grace's forgiveness as something he deserved simply because time had passed. Instead, he chose patience, understanding that love could only grow again where respect had first been restored. On a peaceful morning surrounded by the people who genuinely cared for them, Grace welcomed a healthy baby boy into the world. Charlotte smiled through joyful tears as she carefully placed the newborn into Grace's waiting arms. The tiny child opened bright blue eyes that seemed to reflect both hope and innocence, completely unaware that his quiet arrival had already transformed the future of an entire kingdom. Ethan stepped closer with remarkable gentleness, almost afraid to believe that this moment was real. When Grace looked up, she saw none of the distant king who had once struggled beneath impossible responsibility. She saw only a devoted father whose greatest wish was to protect the family standing before him. Grace carefully placed the baby into Ethan's arms. For several silent moments, Ethan simply stared at his son, overwhelmed by gratitude that words could never fully express. The child wrapped tiny fingers around one of Ethan's hands, and the Alpha King smiled with a quiet joy that everyone in the room would remember for the rest of their lives. Grace watched the simple moment unfold and realized that healing had not arrived through one dramatic gesture. It had come through countless ordinary choices made with honesty, humility, and unwavering commitment. She stepped beside Ethan, gently resting her hand upon his arm. He looked at her with hopeful eyes but said nothing. This time, Grace was the one who smiled first. "Welcome home," she whispered. The words were soft, yet they carried everything neither of them needed to explain anymore. Outside the castle windows, church bells echoed across the kingdom, not as a celebration of royal power, but as a reminder that truth had finally overcome deception and compassion had proven stronger than fear. The people would remember the day an innocent Omega was almost lost, but they would remember something even greater. They would remember the king who accepted responsibility for his failure, the woman whose quiet dignity never surrendered to bitterness, and the child whose life reminded an entire kingdom that the strongest hearts are not those that never break, but those courageous enough to heal together.